He's not getting on this plane, and that's final. Karen Mitchell's voice exploded across gate B-22 with the force of a fire alarm, cutting through conversations and turning heads in every direction. 100 travelers froze mid-step. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Rolling suitcases stopped. Even the overhead announcements seemed to disappear beneath the sound of humiliation echoing through the terminal. Standing quietly near the boarding lane was a tall black man in a faded gray polo shirt, dark jeans, and worn leather shoes. His carry-on rested beside him, and his expression never changed. Nathaniel Brooks simply stood there while every eye in the gate area settled on him. Karen Mitchell, 49 years old and manager of the evening boarding crew, folded her arms and pointed toward the seating area as if she were directing traffic. "Sir, I don't know what game you're trying to play, but you're not boarding this flight." A few passengers exchanged nervous looks. Others pretended not to watch while watching anyway. One older white man shook his head slowly. A young mother pulled her son closer. Two businessmen near the charging station whispered to each other. The atmosphere around gate B-22 wasn't quiet anymore. It was watching. Nathaniel Brooks glanced at his boarding pass once before lifting his eyes toward Karen. "Ma'am, my seat is confirmed," he said calmly. Karen let out a laugh that wasn't loud, but sharp enough to sting. "Not anymore. You're not getting past this gate." Her words landed like stones. Nearby, a white passenger wearing an expensive golf jacket smirked and muttered loud enough for others to hear. People always trying something. A few uncomfortable faces turned away. Others simply listened. Nathaniel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't take a single step forward. He just stood there with the kind of patience that made some people uncomfortable. 20 feet away, Sarah Coleman, a 26-year-old gate agent still new to the job, looked up from her computer. Something about the man's name sounded familiar. She frowned slightly but said nothing. Karen had already made up her mind. "Step aside, sir," she snapped. "You're holding up boarding for actual passengers." The words drifted through the gate like smoke. Actual passengers. The sentence hung in the air, ugly and heavy. Several people shifted in their seats. A teenage girl looked at her father with confusion. A retired couple stopped reading and stared. Nathaniel Brooks remained motionless. His voice was low and steady. "I believe I am exactly where I belong." Karen's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." And at gate B-22, beneath the fluorescent lights and the endless sounds of rolling luggage, no one realized that the quiet man being denied boarding had spent 30 years deciding who belonged in courtrooms across America. But before anyone would learn his name, the humiliation had already begun. Nathaniel Brooks slowly lowered his boarding pass and walked away from the boarding lane without a single complaint. He did not sigh. He did not argue. He simply picked up his carry-on and took a seat near the window overlooking the runway. The lights from arriving aircraft reflected across the glass while travelers continued moving around him, unaware that the calm man sitting alone had spent more than 3 decades listening before speaking. Karen Mitchell watched him with a look of satisfaction. To her, the problem had been solved. She adjusted her badge and motioned for boarding to continue. "Next group," she announced loudly, as if the scene from moments earlier had never happened. But the atmosphere around gate B-22 had changed. Conversations had become quieter. People were not looking at their phones anymore. They were looking at him. Nathaniel sat with both hands resting on the handle of his suitcase. His face carried no anger, only patience. The kind that came from experience. The kind that made some people uneasy. Sarah Coleman glanced toward him again from her station. There was something familiar about the name. She could not explain it. Earlier that week she had spent hours reading company emails involving legal briefings and executive updates. Somewhere in those messages she had seen Brooks, Nathaniel Brooks. Yet the memory remained just beyond reach. Another gate agent leaned over and whispered, "Who is that guy?" Sarah shrugged. "I do not know, but he does not seem worried." Nearby, a middle-aged woman seated with her husband lowered her magazine. "Poor man," she said quietly. "He has not even raised his voice." Her husband nodded. "That usually means something." Across the gate, Karen laughed softly with another employee. "People think they can just walk onto planes nowadays," she said. "Not on my watch." The words drifted through the air and reached several passengers. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nathaniel checked the time on his watch. 8:21 in the evening. Then he folded his hands again. Not because he had given up. Not because he was defeated. He was waiting. Sarah noticed that. Everyone else seemed nervous. Everyone else seemed upset. But Nathaniel Brooks sat as if the world had not changed around him. Like a man who had learned long ago that truth never rushed. It arrived on its own schedule. A young boy sitting nearby looked up at his mother and whispered, "Why is that man sitting all alone?" His mother looked toward Nathaniel and answered softly, "Maybe he is waiting for someone." Nathaniel overheard the question and smiled kindly. But inside, he was remembering another airport, another year, another moment when assumptions had spoken louder than facts. He had been 26 then, fresh out of law school, dressed in a suit he could barely afford. And someone had looked at him the exact same way. Different faces. Same judgment. The memory faded as quickly as it came. Nathaniel adjusted his glasses and looked out toward the runway lights again. Somewhere behind him, Karen Mitchell was smiling. Somewhere across the gate, Sarah Coleman was trying desperately to remember why the name Nathaniel Brooks sounded so important. And neither of them realized that the quiet man they had dismissed had already decided not to fight the moment. He would simply let the truth arrive on its own. At 8:24 in the evening, boarding should have been almost complete, but Gate B-22 no longer felt normal. The energy had changed. People were boarding more slowly. Heads kept turning toward the quiet man sitting alone by the window. Nathaniel Brooks remained calm, his carry-on beside him, his eyes following the blinking lights of a departing aircraft outside. He looked more like someone waiting for a friend than someone who had just been publicly denied boarding. That was what confused people. Karen Mitchell noticed the stares and became irritated. She walked over to another employee and folded her arms. "Keep an eye on him," she whispered. "I do not want him trying anything when final boarding starts." The younger employee looked uncertain. "He has not done anything." Karen rolled her eyes. "Not yet." Nearby, the man in the golf jacket from earlier laughed quietly. "People know how to work the system these days," he muttered to no one in particular. Another passenger nodded without conviction. But several others looked uncomfortable. A retired military veteran seated near the charging station frowned. "The gentleman has done nothing wrong that I have seen," he said quietly to his wife. Across the gate, Sarah Coleman opened the passenger manifest again. Something bothered her. She searched the boarding records and saw the name. Nathaniel Brooks. C2A. Confirmed. Her eyebrows lifted. She clicked twice, then froze. A note had been added beside the reservation. Boarding hold. Manual review. Authorized by manager. Sarah looked toward Karen. "That is strange," she whispered to herself. Karen had never mentioned any security issue. No alert. No incident report. Nothing. Just a manual hold. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Before she could say anything, Karen's voice echoed again. "Security might need to stay close. I do not want surprises tonight." Two airport security officers standing nearby exchanged confused looks. One of them shrugged. "What exactly did the passenger do?" Karen answered immediately. He became argumentative. Sarah blinked. Argumentative? She had been there. The man barely spoke. One of the officers glanced toward Nathaniel. He looks pretty calm to me. Karen lowered her voice. Trust me. The words carried an edge sharp enough to end the discussion. But they did not erase the doubt. More passengers had started whispering. A young couple sitting near the gate looked back and forth between Nathaniel and Karen. He has been sitting there for 20 minutes, the woman whispered. He has not caused any trouble. Her husband nodded. Something feels off. Meanwhile, Nathaniel simply checked the time again. 8:26. He folded his hands and sat quietly. The silence around him seemed stronger than the noise surrounding everyone else. Sarah looked at his name again. Brooks. Brooks. Suddenly a memory flashed through her mind. An email from corporate legal. A conference call briefing. A photograph. Not because he was famous. Because everyone had been instructed to review the name. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. She turned back toward the gate and looked at the quiet man sitting by the window. And for the first time that evening, she felt something she could not explain. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. Sarah Coleman stared at the screen again, then at the man sitting quietly beside the window. Her heartbeat quickened. The memory had returned all at once. 3 weeks earlier, corporate legal had sent out mandatory training materials regarding high-profile litigation involving the airline. There had been a photograph attached to one of the documents. A dignified man with silver at his temples and calm eyes. Judge Nathaniel Brooks. The federal judge presiding over the discrimination case everyone in management had been discussing. Sarah looked back at the passenger manifest. The same name. The same age. The same seat assignment. Her stomach dropped. She immediately stood and walked toward Karen Mitchell. Karen, she said carefully, trying to keep her voice low. I think there might be a mistake. Karen barely looked up. There is no mistake. Sarah swallowed. I think I recognize him. Karen sighed dramatically. Sarah, I have been doing this for 20 years. You have been here 6 months. Trust me. But Sarah refused to sit down. No, I mean I really recognize him. I think his name was in the legal briefings. Karen finally looked up. Her expression hardened. Then stop thinking and get back to work. Sarah glanced toward Nathaniel again. He had not moved. His carry-on remained beside him. His eyes were focused on the lights outside the terminal. He seemed completely untouched by the whispers surrounding him. The veteran sitting near the charging station noticed Sarah's concern. Young lady, he said quietly, that gentleman has more patience than most people I know. Sarah forced a smile. Yes, sir. But inside, she was growing uneasy. She returned to her computer and opened her email archives. Her fingers moved quickly. Legal department. Mandatory review. Federal case update. Then she found it. Attached beneath the message was the photograph. Sarah froze. It was him. Exactly him. Her eyes widened. Oh my goodness, she whispered. Without thinking, she stood up again and hurried toward Karen. Karen, please, you need to see this. Karen frowned. I said I am busy. Sarah lowered her voice. I know who he is. Karen crossed her arms. No, you do not. Sarah held out her phone. Yes, I do. Karen glanced at the screen for less than a second and waved it away. I do not care who he says he is. Nobody is getting on my aircraft after causing confusion. Sarah blinked. Confusion? He had barely spoken all evening. Karen, he did not do anything. Enough, Karen snapped. You are not paid to question me. The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. Around them, Several passengers looked over again. The air at gate B-22 felt heavier now, like the entire room was holding its breath. The retired veteran quietly shook his head. The young couple exchanged worried glances. Even one of the security officers standing nearby looked uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Brooks slowly removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. His movements were calm, deliberate, patient. Sarah watched him from across the gate and realized something unsettling. The man everyone seemed determined to judge was the only person in the room who looked completely at peace. And for the first time that evening, she was no longer worried about him. She was worried about everyone else. Nathaniel Brooks placed his glasses back on and checked the time again. 8:31 in the evening. Outside the window, another aircraft taxied toward the runway, while inside gate B-22, tension floated through the air like a storm no one could see yet. Karen Mitchell had grown more irritated with every passing minute. The whispers among passengers bothered her. Sarah's questions bothered her even more. Determined to end the situation once and for all, she waved over one of the airport security officers. "I want him moved away from the gate," she said. The officer looked surprised. "For what reason?" Karen lowered her voice. "He has disrupted boarding." The officer glanced toward Nathaniel. The quiet man was sitting exactly where he had been for nearly half an hour. "He has not said anything," the officer answered carefully. Karen folded her arms. "I am the manager. I am telling you there is a problem." Reluctantly, the officer approached. Several passengers watched immediately. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Please do not do this," she whispered under her breath. The officer stopped beside Nathaniel and spoke gently. "Sir, would you mind stepping over to another seating area?" Nathaniel slowly looked up. His expression remained calm. "Am I being removed?" The officer hesitated. "No, sir. Just relocated." Nathaniel nodded once. "And why is that?" The officer opened his mouth, but had no answer. Across the room, Karen shouted, "Because we need this area clear." The words echoed louder than she intended. Heads turned again. A woman near the window shook her head. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. The retired veteran stood up slowly. "The gentleman has done nothing wrong." The young couple exchanged nervous glances. Sarah covered her mouth. But the sound of Karen's voice had triggered something inside Nathaniel. Not anger. Memory. Suddenly, he was 20 years old again. Charlotte. 1989. He could still see his father standing inside a small airport restaurant wearing his Sunday suit after church. He remembered the waitress saying they were full, while empty tables sat all around them. He remembered his father smiling anyway. He remembered the drive home. And most of all, he remembered the lesson his father gave him. "Son, never let somebody else's prejudice decide your dignity." Those words had carried Nathaniel through law school, through years of courtrooms, through every challenge life had placed before him. And now, more than 30 years later, standing in another airport under another set of lights, hearing another voice tell him where he did not belong, he remembered his father's smile. The memory faded. Nathaniel looked at the officer and smiled kindly. "Young man, I have sat through harder things than this." The officer lowered his eyes. Something about the man's dignity made him uncomfortable. Around gate B-22, people were no longer pretending not to watch. The room had chosen sides without saying a word. Sarah looked at the photograph on her phone one more time and felt a chill run through her. Because she knew exactly who Nathaniel Brooks was. And she also knew something Karen Mitchell had not yet realized. Every second this humiliation continued was becoming a much bigger mistake. Nathaniel Brooks slowly stood and adjusted his jacket. The airport security officer stepped aside immediately. There was something about the man's calm presence that made confrontation feel impossible. The noise around gate B-22 had faded into whispers. Even the boarding announcement sounded distant. Karen Mitchell looked increasingly frustrated. To her, the situation should have ended 30 minutes ago. Instead, the entire gate had become an audience. Sarah Coleman walked over one last time. Her voice trembled slightly. "Sir," she said quietly, "I know who you are." Nathaniel looked at her kindly and smiled. "Then you know I have seen days harder than this." Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir." Her eyes drifted toward Karen. "And I think she is making a terrible mistake." Nathaniel picked up his carry-on. "People make mistakes every day. What matters is what they do after they realize them." Sarah looked down. She knew Karen was not interested in realizing anything. Across the gate, Karen folded her arms and laughed softly with another employee. "He is still here?" she asked sarcastically. "Unbelievable." The retired veteran shook his head. "That woman has no idea." Nearby, the young couple exchanged uneasy looks. Even one of the security officers appeared uncomfortable. Nathaniel glanced at the clock. 8:37. Then he reached into his pocket and removed his phone. He tapped a number from memory. No hesitation. No drama. No anger. When the line connected, his voice remained low and measured. "Good evening, Rebecca." A woman's voice answered immediately. "Judge Brooks. Are you on your way?" "Not quite." He looked toward the gate. "There has been a complication." Silence followed. Then her tone changed instantly. "What happened?" Nathaniel smiled slightly. "Nothing urgent. But I think Chief Justice Henderson should be informed before tomorrow morning." Sarah froze. The words hit her like ice water. Chief Justice Henderson. She knew that name. Everyone in legal knew that name. Across the room, Karen overheard part of the conversation and burst out laughing. "Chief Justice?" she repeated loudly. "Sure. Why not call the president, too?" A few nervous chuckles followed from people who still thought this was some strange misunderstanding. But others did not laugh. The retired veteran simply lowered his newspaper. The security officer beside him stared at Karen in disbelief. Nathaniel continued speaking. "Please let him know I may be delayed. And tell him I appreciate his patience." Rebecca answered immediately. "Understood, Judge Brooks. I will contact him right away." "Thank you, Rebecca." Nathaniel ended the call and calmly slipped the phone back into his pocket. Karen shook her head and smirked. "Now he is pretending to call judges. This keeps getting better." Sarah felt her heart pounding. She wanted to speak. She wanted to stop this. But Karen's arrogance seemed bigger than reason itself. Meanwhile, Nathaniel simply sat down again, like a man waiting for a train instead of sitting in the middle of a public humiliation. Outside, another plane lifted into the night sky. Inside Gate B-22, nobody realized that somewhere far above their pay grade, telephones were beginning to ring. And the truth, which had remained silent all evening, had finally started moving. 8:42 in the evening. Final boarding should have ended by now, but Gate B-22 felt suspended in time. Nobody was focused on the departure screen anymore. Nobody was watching the planes outside. Every eye seemed to drift back to the quiet man sitting beside the window. Nathaniel Brooks sat calmly, with his hands folded over the handle of his carry-on. His expression had not changed once. Sarah Coleman stood frozen behind the desk. Her mind was racing. She had tried to warn Karen Mitchell. She had shown her the photograph. She had explained what she knew. But Karen had dismissed everything. Now Sarah could only watch. Then Karen's work phone rang. She rolled her eyes. "Probably operations asking why we are delayed," she muttered. Without concern, she answered. "Karen Mitchell speaking." The color drained from her face almost immediately. Her posture straightened. "Yes, sir." Her voice lost every trace of confidence. The passengers nearest the desk fell silent. Sarah watched Karen's expression change from annoyance to confusion. Then confusion became disbelief. "No, sir," Karen answered quickly. "There must be some misunderstanding." A pause. "Yes, sir." Another pause. Karen swallowed. Her hand began trembling slightly. "No, sir. I did not know." The entire gate had gone quiet. Even the overhead announcement seemed distant. One of the security officers exchanged glances with the retired veteran. Nobody spoke. Karen listened again. Then her eyes slowly drifted toward Nathaniel Brooks. And for the first time that evening, she looked afraid. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "I understand." The call ended. Karen remained frozen. Her phone slowly lowered into her hand. Sarah stepped closer. "Karen?" No answer. The young employee had never seen her manager speechless. Another employee whispered, "What happened?" Karen could not answer. Across the gate, Nathaniel Brooks calmly stood and adjusted his jacket. He picked up his carry-on and looked toward the desk. His movements were slow, deliberate. The room parted around him without anyone saying a word. He approached the counter with the same quiet dignity he had carried all evening. Karen stared at him. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Nathaniel placed his boarding pass gently on the counter. "Good evening," he said softly. The retired veteran stood up completely. The young couple stopped breathing for a second. Even the security officers looked uncertain. Sarah's heart pounded. Nathaniel looked directly into Karen's eyes. His voice remained calm. "Ma'am, I believe there has been some confusion." Karen swallowed hard. Nathaniel continued, "You denied boarding to Judge Nathaniel Brooks." The words settled over the gate like thunder without sound. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Nathaniel's eyes never left hers. "The same judge currently presiding over the federal discrimination lawsuit involving this airline." A gasp escaped from somewhere behind the seating area. Sarah closed her eyes. The retired veteran slowly removed his cap. One of the security officers muttered under his breath. The man in the golf jacket lowered his head. And Karen Mitchell, who had spent the last hour speaking louder than everyone else, suddenly found herself unable to speak at all. The silence around her was heavier than any word she could have said. And for the first time that night, the entire gate understood exactly who had been sitting quietly among them all along. No one applauded. No one cheered. Gate B-22 simply fell into a silence, so heavy it seemed to stop time itself. Karen Mitchell stood behind the counter with her phone still in her hand. Moments earlier she had controlled the room with her voice. Now she could not find a single word. The passengers who had watched the entire ordeal no longer looked at Nathaniel Brooks with curiosity. They looked at him with respect. And they looked at Karen with disbelief. Sarah Coleman slowly stepped away from the computer station. Her eyes were filled with regret. Not because of what she had done, but because she had not been able to stop it sooner. The retired veteran removed his cap completely and nodded toward Nathaniel. "Sir," he said quietly, "I apologize for what you experienced here." Nathaniel offered him a gentle smile. "Thank you." Nearby, the young couple exchanged embarrassed glances. The man in the golf jacket, who had made comments earlier, suddenly found his shoes very interesting. Even the security officers stood awkwardly, uncomfortable with being part of something they had never wanted to be involved in. Then another phone rang. This time it belonged to Karen again. Her hand trembled before she answered. "Yes, sir." The voice on the other end was loud enough for Sarah to hear pieces of the conversation. Regional Director Thomas Reynolds. Karen's face lost even more color. Immediately? She whispered. Yes, sir. I understand. Another long pause. No, sir. There were no security concerns. Her eyes closed briefly. Yes, sir. I understand. When the call ended, Karen lowered the phone and stared at the floor. Another employee approached cautiously. Karen? She did not answer. Sarah had never seen her manager look so small. Moments later, Thomas Reynolds himself appeared at the entrance to gate B22, his tie loosened and concern written across his face. He walked directly toward Nathaniel Brooks. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. Judge Brooks, I sincerely apologize. The entire gate watched. Nathaniel shook his hand politely. Thomas glanced toward Karen. There was disappointment in his eyes. No anger. Just disappointment. Sometimes disappointment weighed more than anger. Ma'am, Thomas said quietly to Karen, step away from the counter. The words were soft, yet they seemed louder than anything Karen had shouted all evening. Sarah looked down. Another employee silently took over the computer station. Karen stepped aside without resistance. The authority she had worn like armor all evening had disappeared in seconds. No arguments. No explanations. Just silence. Nathaniel picked up his carry-on. Thomas Reynolds personally handed him a freshly printed boarding pass. The same seat. First class. Confirmed. As Nathaniel accepted it, several passengers quietly moved aside, creating a clear path toward the jet bridge. Not because anyone told them to, but because respect had finally arrived. And behind the counter, Karen Mitchell remained completely silent. Because sometimes the loudest lesson in the world is the moment when there is nothing left to say. The path to the jet bridge had never seemed quieter. Nathaniel Brooks walked slowly, with his carry-on beside him, while conversations around gate B22 remained almost non-existent. It was as though everyone had collectively realized they had witnessed something much bigger than a delayed flight. Thomas Reynolds stayed beside him, apologizing again, but Nathaniel simply smiled. Mr. Reynolds, dignity does not come from apologies. It comes from understanding. Thomas nodded respectfully. You are right, Judge Brooks. Behind them, Sarah Coleman stood near the desk with tears in her eyes. Nathaniel stopped and turned back. Miss Coleman. She looked up immediately. Yes, sir? Nathaniel smiled warmly. Thank you for seeing what others chose not to see. Sarah shook her head. I should have spoken sooner. No, Nathaniel answered gently. You spoke when it mattered. Never underestimate the power of that. Sarah smiled through her emotions. Around her, several passengers lowered their heads. The retired veteran stepped forward and extended his hand. Safe travels, sir. Nathaniel shook it firmly. Thank you. The young couple smiled awkwardly. The man in the golf jacket quietly whispered, I am sorry. Nathaniel nodded politely. Take care. No bitterness. No anger. Just grace. Then his eyes drifted toward the counter one final time. Karen Mitchell remained standing where she had been asked to step aside. Her shoulders slumped. Her confidence gone. The loud voice that had controlled the gate all evening had disappeared. Nathaniel looked at her for several seconds. Not with triumph. Not with resentment. Simply with sadness. Karen slowly raised her eyes. Judge Brooks, she whispered. But the words faded. Nathaniel approached her one last time. The entire gate seemed to stop breathing again. His voice remained calm and steady. Ma'am, you did not owe me respect because I am a judge. Karen lowered her eyes. Nathaniel continued. You owed me respect when I was just another passenger. Tears filled Sarah's eyes again. Even Thomas Reynolds looked away. Nathaniel smiled softly. Titles reveal position. Character reveals people. Karen stood frozen. Her silence said more than words ever could. Then Nathaniel turned toward the jet bridge. Before stepping through the doorway, he paused one final time and looked back at the passengers. Justice does not begin inside a courtroom, he said. It begins in ordinary moments. It begins with strangers. It begins with how we treat people before we know their names. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The retired veteran removed his cap again. Sarah stood straighter. The young couple held hands. And behind the counter, Karen Mitchell remained silent, staring at the floor where her assumptions had finally collapsed. Nathaniel Brooks smiled one last time and disappeared down the jet bridge. Outside the terminal window, another aircraft rose into the night sky. And somewhere beneath the sound of engines and distant announcements, a lesson remained. Real dignity does not need to shout. It simply stands its ground. And sometimes, the strongest voice in the room is the one that never had to raise itself at all.